December 18th, 1944. The fog outside St. Vith. Corporal Otis Kell, 23 years old, presses his eye to the sight of a 90mm gun and watches a king tiger emerge from the tree line at 1,400 yards. His hands are steady. That matters, because 4 months ago they weren't. The last time Otis Kell aimed a gun at German armor, it was a 76 firing from an M10, and the shell that left the barrel didn't punch through anything. It sparked off a Panther's front plate and died in the grass. 3 men in his crew didn't live long enough to hear him apologize for it. He crawled out of that tank alone, and he has spent every day since believing the failure was his. Today, the gun in front of him is different. He still isn't sure he is. Somewhere behind that tree line, a German commander who has never lost a king tiger to anything smaller than another tiger is about to learn that the Americans have found something new. He doesn't know it yet. In about 4 seconds, Otis Kell is going to teach him. Otis Kell was 19 when he first climbed into a Sherman, and he'd wanted nothing more than to be good at it. Loud, easy with the other men, the kind of gunner who could name every part of the 75 blindfolded. On the morning of August 7th, none of that mattered. His commander spotted the Panther column through gaps in the hedge, called the range at 900 yards, and Kell fired the shot he'd trained a year for. The shell struck the Panther's front plate and skipped off like nothing had happened at all. A spark, a flash, and the tank kept coming. He remembers the silence after that more than the sound. His commander screaming back into the intercom. The driver fighting a gearbox that wouldn't hurry. And then the Panther's own shot. 1 round, punching through 3.5 inches of armor like it was nothing built by human hands. Kell doesn't remember deciding to move. He remembers heat and metal that used to be a hull, and hands, not his own, pulling him through a hatch that shouldn't have still been open. 3 men stayed inside. He has never been able to say their names out loud since, not even to himself, not even in the quiet after. They pulled him off the line 11 days after Mortain and gave him a cot in a Repple-Deppel tent outside of Ranches, and Kell used that time the only way he knew how, filling out a transfer request for a rear echelon post, something with a typewriter instead of a gun sight. He handed it to a sergeant named Roscoe Vantry, expecting paperwork to do what paperwork does. Vantry read it standing up, folded it once, and put it in his own breast pocket instead of a file. "Your hands still work?" Vantry asked. Kell said they did. Then they ain't done yet. That was the whole conversation. No mention of the Panther, no mention of the men who didn't get out. Vantry walked him across a muddy field to a half-track where 2 men were arguing about a radio, and introduced him as their new gunner like it was already decided. Like Kell hadn't spent the last week deciding he had no business near a tank destroyer again. Ambrose Duchamp, 19 and grinning, stuck out a hand. Chester Aldous just nodded, sizing him up the way men do when they've learned not to get attached too fast. Neither of them asked what happened to his last crew. Kell understood, later, that Vantry had made sure of that, had given them just enough, and no more, to leave the rest alone. It was the first mercy anyone had shown him since August. The vehicles came in on flatbed trucks under canvas, and nobody was allowed to photograph them, write about them, or say the word 90 outside the motor pool. An ordnance officer none of them recognized gathered the crews in a half circle, pulled the tarp back like a magician clearing his own stage, and said the words like they should have meant something. 90mm gun, longer reach than anything they'd fired before, engage German heavy armor at maximum range, and don't let the enemy know what hit them. Duchamp let out a low whistle. Aldous just stared. Kell stood at the back and felt nothing at all. He'd heard this before. Not this exact sentence, but the shape of it. Some officer standing in front of some new piece of equipment, promising that this was the thing that would finally even the odds. He'd believed it once, back when he still trusted that the army wouldn't hand him something that couldn't do what it claimed. Mortain had cured him of that particular faith. When his turn came to climb up and look down the barrel, he did it because Vantry told him to, not because he expected to feel anything. It was bigger. He could see that much with his own eyes. Bigger had never once meant it would work when it mattered, and Kell wasn't in the business of hoping anymore. He was in the business of staying alive long enough to find out. They found the column behind a stone wall a Belgian farmer had built before any of them were born. Panthers moving in the open, a little over 1,000 yards out, closer than any American gun had ever needed to be, and further than any of them had ever fired with confidence. Kell found the lead tank in his sight and his hands started shaking before Vantry even gave the order. Not from cold. He recognized the feeling from Mortain and hated that his body remembered it so exactly. "Fire when ready," Vantry said, quiet, like it was nothing. Kell fired anyway, because refusing felt worse than being wrong again. The shell crossed the distance in under 2 seconds. For a fraction of a heartbeat, nothing happened, the way nothing had happened at Mortain, and some old, tired part of him had already started bracing for the spark and the bounce. Then the turret hatch blew off its hinges and flame went up 30 feet into the gray sky, and Duchamp was shouting something Kell couldn't make out over the sound of his own pulse. Vantry keyed the radio, reported the kill, and turned to look at him. "Hell of a shot." "Luck," Kell said, and meant it. A gun that worked once wasn't a gun he trusted. It was just a mistake that hadn't caught up to him yet. He kept his eyes on the tree line and waited for the feeling to prove him right. November wore on in a pattern of small, ugly proofs. A Panzer IV caught crossing open ground near a rail cut. An assault gun that tried to reverse behind a barn and didn't reverse fast enough. Nothing as clean as the first kill. Nothing the Army would ever put in a newsreel. Just a string of ordinary afternoons where the gun did what the ordnance officer promised it would, and Kell kept waiting for the afternoon it wouldn't. Vantry drilled them between engagements like the war might pause to let him. Traverse, load, fire, displace, over and over in a frozen field until Duchamp could load in his sleep and complained that he practically did. Duchamp's nerves showed in small ways. A laugh that came a half-second too fast. Hands that never quite stopped moving when the guns went quiet. Aldous wrote letters most nights, short ones, and never read them aloud, though once Kell saw him address one and cross out "if" for "when" before he folded it. Kell didn't write anything. He watched instead, counted kills the way another man might count blessings, cautiously, refusing to spend them before they'd cleared. But somewhere in the counting, without deciding to, he noticed he'd stopped flinching before the shot. He still didn't trust the gun. He was starting, despite himself, to trust his own hands on it again, and that felt like a more dangerous thing to admit. The first week of December was quiet in a way none of them had words for yet, only instincts. No probing patrols. No artillery duels at dusk. The line east of St. Vith sat under a fog that never quite lifted, and men who had spent 5 months learning to read the sound of a battlefield found themselves listening to nothing at all and liking it less than the noise. Rumors moved anyway, the way they always did. A runner from another battalion saying he'd seen more German rail traffic than made sense for a quiet sector, a captured map with markings nobody could fully explain, a radio operator who swore he'd heard 3 different accents on frequencies that should have carried one. Nothing added up to an order. Nobody higher up the chain seemed alarmed enough to make one. The 814th moved into position near St. Vith on routine rotation. Nothing more dramatic than that. Dig in, hold the crossroads, wait. Duchamp joked that they'd finally drawn the easy sector. Aldous didn't laugh, and Kell noticed he didn't. Filed it away the way he'd learned to file away small things that might matter later. Kell dug his position facing east into ground already half frozen, and told himself the stillness meant nothing. He had been wrong about what a quiet morning meant once before, at Mortain, and some part of him that never fully stopped bracing for that lesson to repeat itself was already awake before the fog even broke. At 5:30 on the morning of December 16th, the stillness broke all at once, like something that had been holding its breath finally couldn't. 2,000 guns opened up along a front wider than any of them could see the ends of, and the ground under Kell's position shook in a way that had nothing to do with anything he'd felt before. 90 minutes later, the first reports came in. Armor moving, a lot of it, and not the probing kind. By the 17th, the picture had a name nobody wanted to say out loud. A real offensive, the largest the Germans had thrown west in years, and St. Vith sitting square in the middle of the roads they needed. Vantry got the order and didn't waste words passing it down. Get to the crossroads, dig in behind whatever cover the ground offered, and hold. They moved at speed through columns of retreating infantry, survivors of a division that had never fired a shot before that morning. Men with a look on their faces Kell recognized because he'd worn it himself once, outside a burning M10. Duchamp went quiet in a way that wasn't like him. Aldous drove like the road owed him something. Word came down the line before they'd even finished digging in. King Tigers, advancing through the fog in column, no air support coming for days. Kell settled behind the gun and understood, without anyone saying it, that whatever came next would decide more than his own life. The first king tiger came through the fog at 1,500 yards, and Kell let it close the way Vantry had taught him. Patience over instinct, the range card be damned. When he finally fired, the round struck the hull side, and the column did what German columns had been doing for 2 months without knowing why. It stopped. Deployed, started hunting for a muzzle flash that had already moved. That was the rhythm of the next 6 days. Fire, back out, reposition 200 yards down the line, fire again. Kell stopped counting kills somewhere on the second day, too busy staying alive to keep score. The gun worked every time he asked it to, and some quiet, stubborn part of him had finally stopped waiting for the exception. On the 4th day, a tiger they hadn't spotted put a round into the ground 20 feet from their position, while Duchamp was outside the hatch, hauling ammunition through the snow. The blast threw him flat and left him not moving, and for one long second Kell felt the old paralysis reaching for him, the same stillness that had once cost him 3 men. He didn't let it land. He was out of the turret and across the ground before Vantry even shouted, dragging Duchamp back by the collar of his coat while shrapnel still ticked down around them. Duchamp came to coughing, alive, cursing him for tearing his jacket. Kell realized, hauling him inside, that this time his hands hadn't shaken at all. St. Vith held 6 days, longer than anyone had promised it could, and by early January, the offensive that was supposed to reach Antwerp lay broken across the snow behind them, fuel-starved and finished. Word came down that the secrecy order was lifted. The 90 was just a gun now, no longer a whisper the army had to protect. Vantry read the notice once, folded it, and told Duchamp to find some paint. They argued for an hour over what to write on the barrel. Duchamp wanted something bold, something for the newsreels. Aldous wanted nothing at all, said the gun didn't need a name to have done its job. In the end, they settled on something smaller than either of them wanted, and truer than what Kell would have picked alone, and nobody made a speech about it. That night, in a farmhouse with half a roof, Kell wrote a letter for the first time since Mortain. Not about the gun, not about the range, or the kills, or the 6 days. He wrote about Duchamp's laugh, and Aldous crossing out if for when, and the particular, ordinary miracle of 3 names he could still say out loud without his throat closing. He sealed it and looked across the room at the 2 of them, Duchamp asleep sitting up, Aldous cleaning a rifle he didn't need to clean, and felt something he hadn't let himself feel in 5 months. Not victory, just quiet, and the 3 of them still in it together.